Kia kaha, Chairman.
I call the Honourable John Boscowan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This debate on these two bills has developed into a form of general debate over the budget. And I think, Mr Speaker, it's very timely to look back on the last 2.5 years of this John Key-led national government. And Mr Speaker, let's acknowledge that the National Party inherited a very difficult situation. They inherited, sir, an economy that was already in recession, that was in recession long before the rest of the world joined in, Mr Speaker, and they inherited a situation, Mr Speaker, of rapidly growing increases in government expenditure that had occurred, sir, since the 2005 election. And so the tragedy, the absolute tragedy of the 2005 general election is the result looked as though it was going to be so close that the Helen Clark-led government went out, sir, and went on a massive spending spree. They went out and they tried to buy the votes of ordinary New Zealanders, Mr Speaker, and we're still paying for it to this very day, and I suspect, Mr Speaker, we'll be paying for it for many years yet. Sir, they extended the interest-free student loan scheme. Sir, they made it so generous that any student studying at a tertiary institution would be absolutely crazy not to borrow, Mr Speaker, the absolute maximum amount of money they can. Why would you, if you're a parent, why would you want to contribute to your own child's education if you could put that money instead into a bank, earn interest over the many years that that student, that child of yours will be studying, because, Mr Speaker, under the interest-free student loan scheme, that money can be paid back in devalued dollars, in debased dollars, many years into the future. And so the extension of the interest-free student loan scheme, just like the substantial extension to the Working for Families package, was an indication of the massive increase in government expenditure that the National Party inherited. However, Mr Speaker, one has to query and look very critically at how the National Party has dealt with that situation. They didn't cause that situation, Mr Speaker, but it was the National Government's responsibility to address that issue. Now, the Minister of Finance earlier this afternoon in this debate said that the 2009 budget focused on infrastructure. They went about putting in place the building blocks for infrastructure. Very important. Roads, investment, schools, hospital, and particularly roading in Auckland, Mr Speaker. 2010 was the tax switch budget. That was the budget where the rate of GST went up, so the cost of consuming went up, the additional controls were put on the deductibility of depreciation, so property investment wasn't such a profitable business, Mr Speaker, but in return we had reductions in income tax, so that rewarded people, Mr Speaker, who went out there and worked, and it provided an incentive to work. It also rewarded people, Mr Speaker, who wanted to save. And the Minister referred this afternoon to 2010 being the tax risk budget. And then finally he went on to 2011. This was the budget where we actually tried to get the government books back into balance. Well, Mr Speaker, I believe that the last 2.5 years has seen very many lost opportunities. There is no doubt that the National Government inherited a very difficult situation, inherited a situation where the world was going into recession. In fact, we've seen it just this week, sir, with the debt crisis escalating in Europe and the brinkmanship that we saw in the United States just last week. But, sir, if you actually look at what the government said back in 2010, they budgeted to spend $1.1 billion in new initiatives last year and $1.1 billion in new initiatives this year. Except that what happened, Mr Speaker, we had an earthquake. We had a very serious earthquake that reinforced to New Zealanders the difficult situation New Zealand was in, and so that caused for a re-examination by the National Party of their spending priorities. And they very proudly told us during the budget, Mr Speaker, that they've been able to identify $5.2 billion of expenditure over 4 years that could be reprioritised, and of that $5.2 billion, Mr Speaker, they allocated $4 million back into frontline services, whether that be in education, in health, in justice or whatever area, with a net saving of $1.2 billion. So what I'm trying to say, Mr Speaker, is the government went from anticipating spending an extra $1 billion to a net saving of $1.2 billion over 4 years. So that's a turnaround of about $1.5 billion a year. It actually took the Christchurch earthquake for this government to start to have a serious examination of expenses. And so when push came to shove, essentially we saw a $1.5 billion turnaround. And we know that some of the areas where the cuts in expenditure were made, the real cuts in expenditure, whether they were to KiwiSaver, the trifling around the edges on student loans, or also in other areas of government expenditure, Mr Speaker. But what the ACT Party is saying is that this government has been far too laxical about it. It hasn't identified the real issue. We heard the Finance Minister speak this afternoon about the need to get our debt under control. Yet what do we see, Mr Speaker? We actually see a budget with a $16.8 billion deficit. A $16.8 billion deficit. Now we know that that's been accentuated by the Christchurch earthquake. We know that of that $16.8 billion, $5.5 billion relates to Christchurch. But take that out, Mr Speaker, we would have still seen a budget with an $11 billion deficit. And if it hadn't been for the Christchurch earthquake, the government wouldn't have taken that critical look at its expenditure. And so what ACT says is that that has been a lost opportunity, but worse, Mr Speaker, they haven't done a good enough job at it because there are so many areas of wasted expenditure. And one only needs to look, Mr Speaker, at the issue of, say, student loans. Yes, they have made changes around the edges. Yes, they have said that people over the age of 55 can't borrow for their living costs. Yes, they've said that people who want to borrow to study to become a pilot won't be able to borrow as generously. And yes, they've said people who are overseas may have to start paying interest on their loans sooner than they otherwise might. But they've essentially left the interest-free student loan scheme in place. And sir, wouldn't you be absolutely crazy as a parent, as a student, not to borrow the most amount of money you can? The government is essentially saying to students and to their parents, come and borrow the money. Come and borrow your living costs. Come and borrow for course fees, and we won't charge you any interest on it, and you can pay it back in several years' time. Well, sir, our country faces a crisis. It faces a crisis, Mr Speaker, where we're forecasting to spend $16.8 billion more than what we take in an income tax this year, and just under $10 billion next year. We're facing a crisis. Now, the Finance Minister claims he's got the books back in order. He claims that the deficit will be back into surplus by 2015, Mr Speaker. But those are based on assumptions of the New Zealand economy growing at 4% in 2013 and 3% in 2014. But if you look at the last year, growth in New Zealand was only 1%. This year it's forecast at 1.8%. But to make the books actually balance, Mr Speaker, Treasury are forecasting growth of 4%. And is that realistic? I actually ask members of the National Party to ask themselves, is it realistic to expect that we're going to get growth of 4% at a time of global financial meltdown? We don't know what's happening to our major trading partners in Europe and the United States. Yes, we know that a lot of our export revenues come from Asia, but so we are enjoying record high commodity prices right now, and we can't be certain that we're going to retain those. Sir, the government has also made cuts to KiwiSaver, and I've said to this Parliament before, the people who gain from those, Mr Speaker, are actually the lower income people. It's actually the lower income who actually can't afford to be in KiwiSaver who are having to pay their taxes so the middle class get those subsidies. And so it always fascinates me when the Labour Party criticise tax cuts to the subsidies on KiwiSaver, because those subsidies are being paid by the very people the Labour Party purports to represent. Mr Speaker, the National Party inherited a crisis. It wasn't in their own making, but they could have done a lot more and can still do a lot more, and the ACT Party intends, possibly can, to put a lot more backbone into the National Party spine following
Sorry to
November
interrupt
26th.
the honourable member. His time has expired. Called Jonathan Young.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker.